This webinar is titled God's Providences in American History, of overview of 200 years from 1620 to 1826, and is a part of an overall series on God's providences. George Washington said this: "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." In this webinar, we're taking the breakdown of a sermon by Bishop James Madison, the cousin of James, to look at different time periods of American history in which God's providences manifested themselves. The first observation that he made is that God's providence seems to have protected the North American continent from the powers of the world so that it could be a safe haven for those fleeing religious persecution. Before 1620, the world global powers seemed to be most in play on these continents, in Europe, in Asia, in India, in Russia, in Africa, tribal peoples, and even in South America, large organized empires of the Aztecs and Incas. The North American continent seemed to be hidden from view from these world powers of that time period until God's perfect timing to be a safe haven for those experiencing religious persecution in other parts of the world. The second observation that Madison makes is God's providences in the Pilgrim story. William Bradford, the governor of the Pilgrims, said this in his journal: "My purpose is that their children may see with what difficulties their fathers had to wrestle in accomplishing the first beginnings, and how God ultimately brought them through. They cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world, even though they should be stepping stones to the others in performance of so great a work." Well, God's providence is manifested mightily in the Pilgrim story, and I'm going to touch on them now, but you can watch a full-length video and hear them all explained. Persecution had a purpose in their life that drove them from England to Holland. They survived a North Sea storm that destroyed dozens of ships, and hundreds of lives were lost, except the Pilgrims survived. The women and children were rescued from the King of England's army. No one died on the journey to the New World. They had a landing place that was well drained and cleared already, but there were no native peoples living there. Within months, a Christian, English-speaking Indian named Squanto came into their midst. The chief of the tribes in that area, Massasoit, signed a 50-year peace treaty with them that was upheld and is a model for how two people groups can get along with one another. They explored an economic philosophy of communism, but then discovered free markets worked far better and set the tone for what would become the free markets of the United States. They discovered a letter of betrayal that would have sunk their efforts, and they believed that they were but stepping stones and that God had seen them through. These providences are astonishing when you hear them explained in detail, but William Bradford says this: "It was to the astonishment of many and almost to the wonder of the world that from so small a beginning such great things should ensue. But it was the Lord's doing, and it ought to be marvelous in our eyes." The third observation that Madison makes in his sermon is this: that in God's providence he sent liberty-loving people here. You see, in Europe in the 1500s the Reformation was taking place. John Knox, John Calvin, and Martin Luther began the Reformation, and the Pilgrims were the carriers of their ideas that the Bible applies to all of life, both personal and societal. These four societal spheres, when properly balanced, provide maximum individual freedom and liberty: the individual with self-responsibility and self-government, the family full of love, care, provision of children, and the education of children and providing legacy, the church for inspiration, transformation, encouragement, accountability, and proclamation, and the government's simple role of protection and justice. In 1607 these ideas were brought here. In 1620 through the 1670s, and in the 1700s to the 1760s, liberty-loving people began to populate the East Coast. The next time period we'd like to talk about is God's providences before the Revolutionary War. John Witherspoon raised this theme: that divine providence can be very obvious or very subtle and almost hidden. God's providence can be clearly discerned by those whose hearts are turned toward Him. Well, this was a subtle period. God's providential activity was displayed in this: public unity, spiritual unity, and public order where little government existed to maintain it. This preceded the Revolutionary War period. And then his providences during the Revolutionary War period were profound. Witherspoon said God's providences include the use of weather and seasons to defeat his foes, and it would be criminal to not observe how God has acted on behalf of the American colonies. And this can be seen from several data points here that you can explore in detail in the full-length video on this channel. But there was a revival that unified the colonies before the Revolutionary War. Also, in George Washington's young military career, he had 3 bullets shot through his coat, and yet he survived unharmed in the French and Indian War. Psalm 35 was the assigned reading for the First Continental Congress. It was providential in the fact that that psalm was read on that particular day. Providential storms, fog, and the discovery of some unique defenses allowed Washington's army to free Boston from a blockade. Another time, storms, calm, and fog allowed Washington to escape unharmed from Brooklyn Heights, where the American army was about to be captured. A baron from Germany came to Valley Forge in their greatest time of need and helped drill the American troops into a hardened, ready battle force. In the South, it seemed that rivers would rise every time the American army would cross them and cut the British off from pursuit. And then at Yorktown, storms came in and blew British escape ships away from the shore so that the British were captured and could not escape, and the American War for Independence was won. These were astounding providences, but those providences didn't discontinue then. Madison observes that God's providences were a great and quick advance of the American model of liberty after the Constitution was passed, and he made these observations: that the United States quickly had risen to eminent rank among nations, that the sons and daughters in America were worshiping God, and we had the first written social compacts in the world, that these social compacts delineate a government based on eternal truths, that the blessings of agriculture, sciences, arts were shared around the world. Our navies were full of the fruits of our agriculture and industry, and we were self-governing citizens. A transformation of Europe had begun based on the American experiment. These amazing providences unfolded. Our forefathers would have fell to their faces and exclaimed, "This is the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes." Well, one last providence as we take a look at this sweep of history. God's providence is on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both had lived to that day, and they both were hoping to live to the 50th anniversary of independence, and they did. And then they passed away on July 4th of that year within hours of each other. And again, there's a full story that you can watch on this amazing providence. Bishop James Madison would have said this: "There does not appear in history a nation whose people had more cause to be grateful to God. These providences seem too amazing to be true." The history of America is a manifold display of divine providence. Let the righteous with eagle eyes look upon the great things he has done. Indeed, this is Christian Civics Training. Thanks for listening.